And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Washington, D.C., Chen Li, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. In New York, New York, Sharon Hom, Executive Director of Human Rights in China. And here in studio, Bernie Froelich, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at York University. Gordon Chang, columnist at Forbes.com. And Jeremy Paltiel, Professor of Political Science at Carleton University. Chang, can I go to you first in Washington? Right off the top of the program in the opening animation, we described this kind of tacit bargain between the Chinese Communist Party and the people. You get rich, we stay in power. Is that what it is?
Well, to a certain extent, that's true, because the government or the party emphasizes stability and certain interest in stability, but so does the China's middle class and also society at large. And secondly, the Chinese government emphasizes a kind of nationalistic sentiment, talk about China as a rising power, and so people wanted to see China to continue on the right track to do well economically and also in other fronts as well. And finally, there's some problems, some criticism of the corruption and the local leaders' problem, but usually the top leaders are quite popular, particularly Premier Wen Jiabao, and they really react very quickly with the earthquake, storm, and other problems.
Sharon, from your viewpoint, is that basically the deal? You get rich, we stay in power, everybody goes along tickety-boo?
Yeah, I think that's generally correct, but I would add that, first of all, that's the kind of a post-'89 implicit deal that was really cut, not with all the 1.3 billion people, but was really cut with the intellectual, political, and economic elites. And so it's a deal with the elites, and that's why you're seeing that falling apart now with the economic slowdown and with the impact of the global economic crisis, is that what you're seeing is at the top, the elites that were benefiting from that deal are now finding that they're being impacted. Like, for example, college graduates, you know, the 6 million that are graduating every year are not able to find work. And then the bottom, who had been left out of the deal, because there are losers and winners in every deal, the ones who had really been left behind, the migrants, the rural inhabitants of the, you know, the over 600 million, the over 200 million migrants, the ones who are the losers. I think now you're getting the bottom pressure and you're getting the top pressure that is really putting pressure on the leadership to continue to deliver both to the top, and now they're finding that if they don't deliver to the bottom, they're going to be squeezed in the middle too.
That's a nice setting of the table. We'll get into all of those issues throughout the course of the hour tonight. Bernie, how about from you? How effective do you think this tacit pact between Chinese Communist Party and people is doing today?
Well, it's been very effective up until now. I think that there have been problems. There have been problems in civil society. There have been problems in different sectors of China, corruption at the bottom. But by and large, the legitimacy of the party has been, in a sense, reinforced by the tremendous economic boom. That may change now. If there's no boom, if the stock market has fallen by 65%, if people's investment in housing has dropped, if their kids can't get jobs, if the migrant workers are hanging around looking for work, then there may be a real threat to the stability of the system on which this whole pact is based. So we don't know what's going to happen, but I think this is the problem of the next couple of years.
Gordon, how would you gauge it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say. I mean, China had, 13, 14, 15% growth in reality in 2007. In the first couple months of 2009, the economy is probably contracting, getting smaller. And you know, that's going to be difficult for any political system because China has the world's fastest slowing economy. And you know, who knows what the societal implications of that will be, but certainly they're going to be serious, especially for a government which has really rested upon the basis of continual delivery of prosperity. The Communist Party has now got to change the basis of its legitimacy from prosperity, which there isn't very much of these days, to something else. And that something else is probably nationalism, as we just heard.
Jeremy, how do you see it?
I mostly agree. I mean, we've been talking about China for the last 15 years ago as having a bicycle economy. That is to say, if it's not going forward, it's going to fall over. And remarkably, the Chinese leadership has been able, even through the Asian economic crisis of the late 1990s, to keep the economy going forward. But now the political deal, that you call it, has not been one which calls on anybody to make a sacrifice. And right now, it's being squeezed. It's being squeezed, as Sharon said, at both the bottom and the top. It's not necessarily just at the top. When we talk about the 6 million university graduates this year will be graduating in July, and there are already 1.something million university graduates from last year who still haven't found jobs. And these 7 million odd graduates, or actually talk about the graduates this year and last year, 12 million graduates, most of them are from groups of people who've just entered the universities. University enrollment has quintupled in the last 10 years. So people coming in are people who are now aspiring to a better life.
Well, let me put that to Chen, because if we were talking Canada or the United States and we heard there were 7 million people just graduated from post-secondary institutions with no jobs waiting for them, that would be a catastrophe. In a country of 1.3 billion people, is it?
Well, first of all, let me add one thing. You know, Sharon mentioned about the losers and winners. That's certainly true. But during the past 3 or 4 years, under the leadership of Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, they really take a populist approach, talk about harmonious society, talk about social justice and fairness, and try to shift the policy from Jiang Zemin or Deng Xiaoping era to favor coastal region or entrepreneurial class to the farmers, migrant workers, and the urban poor. So Gordon Zhang early on mentioned about the Communist Party need to change its the basis of legitimacy. In my view, it's already changing from the economic growth to social fairness and justice, or try to reduce economic disparity. Now, the question about the unemployment, certainly it's a serious problem, and particularly the middle class, because middle class interests also hurt. This is the college graduates, usually part of the middle class. Now, at the same time, the government reacted very quickly. They tried to create all kind of programs. Someone said that there's a post-undergraduate, just like in the United States, postdoctoral fellowship. So try to help these undergraduates to find a job. They also gave some quotas for local government, try to help them. At the same time, they also introduced a program called One College Graduate Per Village, ask these students to go to countryside to help rural development. So I don't know whether it can work or not, but certainly it's the focus of the government.
Bernie.
This is interesting to compare to the United States. Obama is trying very hard to develop a stimulus package to get the American economy moving. He's running into all kinds of problems. Here you have China, an authoritarian government. Does it have the better capacity now in a crisis to go in and provide social programs, provide jobs for students, provide work for those out of work, and do it more quickly? I think we should consider that, whether we like it or not. If we believe that we don't like authoritarian systems, China may have the capacity at this crisis to act more quickly to help solve these problems. Gordon probably will disagree.
Is shaking his head already. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead, Gordon.
And I'd like to jump in at some point.
Sure, Gordon and Sharon, go ahead.
There are a lot of things wrong with this stimulus package, but one of the things that's most important is that, first of all, it's not going to work for a number of technical reasons, but what it's doing is it's sort of emphasizing the state economy. And China has grown like 9.9% throughout the reform era because there was the creation of the private sector and its development. And that has really powered China. But the political leaders now are sort of going back to the old Maoist way of doing things, which is to build another road or a dam. And I don't think that that's really going to work. So this stimulus package, although they may be able to actually implement it, I don't think it's going to really push the country in the right direction.
Sharon?
Yeah, I think on the stimulus package, two additional points on it. This is, first of all, not a new stimulus package. This is actually a package that the authorities had announced earlier and that now is getting more attention. Secondly, early in January of this year, the Shanghai lawyer Yan Yiming filed a request under the new Open Government Initiative, which was intended to have greater transparency and access by citizens to information held by governments. And he filed 2 requests to the Ministry of Finance and to the National Development and Reform Commission, and he asked for details to be disclosed of this 4 trillion renminbi stimulus package. That request was denied, and then he went to and filed a second request, and now in March, largely because of public pressure, wanting details, just like as it's been earlier raised that in the U.S. that I think the Obama administration with the stimulus package is really focusing and saying we're going to make it transparent, i.e. accountable. We're going to make sure that the money is well spent. This is happening in China too, particularly after these open government initiatives. And as of this month, because I think of the growing public attention to this request and to the impact and the desire of Chinese citizens to know the details of this huge stimulus packet, we understand that now on an administrative rehearing request by the lawyer, as of March 3rd, the authorities have now, it's pending before them for an administrative reconsideration. So I would say that we would just caution that if we're going to say this and this and this about the stimulus packet, we have to say, well, how do we know? And how do we know what it is before we can even project what kind of impact it's going to have?
Always useful questions to ask when we're talking about this part of the world, indeed. Jeremy, how about on this? Let me move the conversation somewhat. Social unrest. How much social unrest has there been? I mean, again, we go back to the original deal. You get you get rich, we stay in power, no social unrest. But there has been social unrest in the past few years.
Social unrest has been rising.
Yeah.
It's been rising continuously over the last few years. But the basis of social unrest has also been changing. So that much of the social unrest that we've seen over the last few years has occurred over property issues. So people who've had their, farmers who've had their land expropriated, or middle-class people who feel either that their land has been expropriated or the value of their houses that they have bought is being impinged upon by other developments around them. So that to simply talk about social unrest as a kind of undifferentiated category is misplaced. Because in some level, the rising social unrest is a sign of greater maturity of China's middle classes in terms of demanding their rights. Now, the government is certainly very, very concerned about social unrest. And in fact, over the last 2 years, they stopped publishing the global figures which they used to give, which were rising up until 2005. And now they stopped publishing, giving out those public numbers, although they're certainly rising. And they've also, I mean, they have a kind of three-pronged attack. When social unrest rises, usually what they do is arrest the ringleaders, repress the unrest, and then try to placate the people for whom, on the basis of which the unrest is going on. So they do all three at the same time. And that's a kind of generalized response to almost all the unrest.
Well, except, Chen, I had thought, at least I thought I'd read in I guess, more recent Chinese history, that they were sort of allowing the tap to be opened a little more as it related to public demonstrations and so on. Is that accurate?
Well, absolutely, because now they have to adjust the societal pressures. In a way, the central government want to localize this protest. So there's a popular saying goes like, think nationally, blame locally. So if there's a problem, local leaders should be taking responsibility. But the populist national leaders, they reach out. Now, of course, how long they can continue that, we don't know. But in terms of social unrest, largely it's related with the land lease. The gentleman said it's absolutely right. But at the same time, since Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao came to power, they reduced the local leaders, the authority or approval for the land lease, try to minimize the social unrest. Now, this caused some tension between central leaders and the local leaders. This is another dimension to watch.
Bernie, but let me get your view on this. In the past, if there were demonstrations of almost any kind, they would be dealt with extreme prejudice, as it were. Nowadays, not so much. How come?
Well, a number of things. First of all, there's a lot of stuff going on. Civil society is emerging, and there is much more space for people to voice their opinions about the government, about officials, about corruption. Sometimes it doesn't last very long. They have these blogs, and then the blogs suddenly disappear very quickly. It's a tremendous censorship system. But the fact is, the internet and the cell phones have transformed China. This is a different China today than 10, 15 years ago. People have more information. They've also learned how to demonstrate. In Shanghai, a few months ago, they were demonstrating against a project that was going to run a train through their neighborhood. They didn't go out with placards and didn't get a permit. They just walked in the streets for several afternoons, strolling, hundreds, thousands of them. And the regime had to stop and take note of that. On the blogs, they begin to use Aesopian language to refer to things by other names so they don't get censored. There's a lot of things going on. In other words, people have got a better sense of how to deal with the regime. Some ways it reminds me of because I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, of what was happening with dissent and the public in the Soviet Union then, as they began to sort of expand their horizons against the regime, and the regime really couldn't control it anymore. How can the regime control the internet? They think they can, but when you have 300 million users and 600 million cell phones, it's going to be every day it's harder for them to do it.
Sharon, I need to hear from you on this.
Yeah, I think that when we say that there seems to be greater space, China is not monolithic, and I'm stating the obvious, and that it's really, I would use the word volatile, and I would say that it's very difficult to make a statement that's true for all of China. So for example, that there's greater space to protest, I would say that's completely not true in Tibet or in the Tibetan areas where it's really essentially a military occupation at this time. And that's of course because of the sensitive anniversary this month. The second thing is how the authorities have been responding to the unrest. I think we're going to see something similar and different in the year 2009, so that we have a year that's 5621. So this month, the 50th anniversary of the Tibetan occupation and the fleeing of the Dalai Lama from Tibet. 6, the 60th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. 2, the 20th anniversary of the crackdown in 1989. And 1, the 10th anniversary of Falun Gong. So, you know, the fact that there's this expression, 5621in Chinese now, really reflects that the leadership is very clear that in this year of sensitive anniversaries, that how unrest, however much less or more space there was that's shifting, is going to be less in this very sensitive year.
I want to focus just and hope you can help us on this, on the 20 million people who we are told have left the cities and gone back to the rural areas where they came from because their jobs have disappeared in the cities. I think it's fair to say that political and cultural change in Chinese history has often started in the rural areas. Is this a ticking time bomb?
There are a lot of ticking time bombs, and I think that's really the problem. You know, you look at 20 million migrants who don't have work. Obviously, that's going to be a source of instability at some point. But there's also a lot of people in the big cities of Shanghai, for instance, who, for various reasons, as you've talked about, could also be the source of instability. I think one of the problems is, you know, in China, in the last 25 years or so, even more than that, there's been this continual increase in living standards. There's been increase in GDP, gross domestic product. The economy has grown ever upward, and you're dealing with a whole generation of Chinese who have never seen a downturn, or they have never sort of suffered anything, as we were talking about, in terms of sacrifice. And all of a sudden, the Chinese economy goes from being a hero to a zero in the space of months. And I think that's going to be very hard, because for the first time, this is not just a question of rising expectations. This is a question of seeing something that people have never seen before. And that's why I think that if you look around Chinese society, not only at the unemployed or the people who can't get jobs, but also the people who have done very well, it's going to be hard. The most popular person in China a couple months ago was an unemployed migrant who walked into a police compound in Shanghai, killed 6 police officers, wounded 4 others on July 1st, the anniversary of the party. And middle-class Chinese were protesting outside his trial, and they were chanting things like, "Down with the Communist Party," and they had banners which said, "Long live the killer." These are people, middle-class Chinese, who have been the great beneficiaries of 3 decades of reform, and yet they sort of got the point across to everybody that the Communist Party is not very popular. And I think anything can happen when everybody in the country thinks the same way.
Chen, how do you see this, for lack of a better expression, ticking time bomb in the rural areas? Go ahead, Chen.
Well, the Chinese society become increasingly diversified. There are different views, different values. And we do need to ask ourselves that is China on the verge of revolution, or is China on the verge of collapse, or China is doing better, making some progress, or China is a rising power? I tend to think China is making progress and continue to rise. I think, of course, it's with mixed progress and problems. Yes, there's economic disparity. Yes, there's corruption. There's abuse of human rights, but also there's tremendous improvement in this area. And again, the Chinese government try to work very hard to be more accountable, and the Chinese media and already become quite commercialized. So the battle is still going on in terms of media freedom, but who will win in the time of telecommunication revolution? I think the answer is simple. But at the moment, the priority is economic recovery. And look at China. Chinese government has some strengths, or Chinese society has some strengths in terms of strong foreign reserve, strong state assets, and a huge market. And the Chinese people are very hardworking, and there's very strong Chinese entrepreneurship. So to a certain extent, this is the optimistic reason for quick recovery.
Jeremy, how do you see it?
I think in some ways both Gordon and Chung are right. But we have to take a kind of differentiated perspective. Because what you see here is a society where, for the last 30 years, everybody, I mean everybody, is better off than they were before. And some are much better off, some are not as much better off, but everybody is much better off. And they have lived in the expectation that this is going to continue. The other thing we have to bear in mind is the genius of Deng Xiaoping in encouraging the market was not just to bring prosperity, but was to get the party out of running the details of every person's life, so that people now feel they succeeded on their own power and are proud of themselves, and they may say, I don't need the party, or I don't need the government. The problem is what happens on the day when they do need the government and the government is not there for them. Well, what happens if the private sector doesn't provide them the livelihood that they expect based on their own efforts? That is, I think, the question we're looking for, not from the past. I think Chung Li is absolutely right about what's happened over the last 30 years. The question is whether there'll be a crunch point somewhere down the line in the next few months.
Is that day today, Bernie?
Well, we're political scientists and we pretend to be able to predict, but we can't. Let's face it. I mean, I was in Moscow in the Soviet Union in '88 and '89, and I didn't expect the whole thing to collapse in a puff of smoke. So I think that, is there going to be regime change? I don't think so in the short term. I think the party has, for all its warts and all its problems, the party has worked very hard since the '90s to try to resurrect itself at the center of things and to do exactly what Jeremy said, to try to expand the role of the non-state party sector under its direction. The people in the party that we've come in contact, I have at the top, are extremely competent people. They're not a bunch of ideologues running around trying to foist communism on the world. They are as smart as any of our CEOs anywhere, because that's not much to say these days. But still, I think that, and we've been training a lot of party officials here in Toronto at the university, several thousand of them. I'm not saying they're perfect. And I'm not saying that you can succeed, 75 million people can succeed running a country of 1.3 billion people forever. I don't think so. I don't think they can. But I think in the short term right now, there's enough legitimacy for the party. The popular opinion, public people there, the public supports the party for better or for worse, in the absence of any other alternative. What else is there?
I should get a comment from Sharon, who's in the land of the disgraced CEO tonight. Go ahead, Sharon. You're in the shadow of Wall Street.
Yeah, and as an NGO, we are definitely not in the private sector. And you know, I think that there's a lot of references to China as becoming a market system or capitalism. And first, I would say that I don't think that's true. China is not a capitalist system. The economist Amartya Sen questions, particularly this week, he's been questioning whether there's any capitalist system that really exists in the world. But I do think that if we want to talk about markets, even with Chinese characteristics, to have a functioning market system that's going to be able to deliver on the goods, you really need reliable, transparent, accurate information. And the second thing you need is really good governance. And the third thing you need is a rule of law. And on all three, from a human rights perspective and from an international assessment perspective that has looked at these areas, these are areas that are serious problems in China.
Gordon and then Jeremy.
You know, the Communist Party is trying to weed out the Gorbachevs and the Mao Zedongs because it wants people who are sort of just, you know, nice and fit in cocktail parties. The problem is I don't think they really now have an effective system. because they don't have an emperor, they don't have half an emperor, they have you know, sort of like an Andropov or Chernenko, maybe a little bit nicer.
What does that mean? Like a technocrat?
Like a technocrat, old guy, not really doing very much.
And not around for a long time, probably.
And perhaps not around for a long time. And that's why I think that you have a system, well, some people have called more resilient, you know, more bureaucratic, more institutional. But on the other hand, you don't have the leaders who can actually move China. You know, it works in it when everything else is doing well in the world, but now, you know, we're approaching one of those cliffs where we have perhaps discontinuous change around the world. China has to react fast. Its leadership has got to be effective. And I don't think these guys can do it because it is a collective leadership that does move slowly, that only moves by consensus almost all the time. And they just don't have the consensus that they need to do the things that China must have in order to continue and get through this period.
Just take another 20 seconds. The standing committee that we've heard referred to already a couple of times on the program. How many people on that, and what's their responsibility? Who can help us on that?
9 old guys.
Nine old guys?
9 old guys.
7.
Well,
Used to be 7.
Yeah.
Now,
Any-
it's 9.
9.
Sharon, any women on this at all?
No.
No.
No. 9 old guys.
well,
9.
there's a woman in the power bureau, 25 people. Now let me add
The
one
average
thing.
age
I
is
look at it. I look at it in a more positive way, and the transition from strongman politics like Mao or Deng to a collective leadership, started with Jiang Zemin, now Hu Jintao, I see is a progress. This is a way to avoid a single-minded approach. And also, there's tensions, there's a power struggle, but this power struggle is not a zero-sum game. In Chinese politics, zero-sum game translated, I win, you die, but not anymore, because of power sharing. In my view, there's 2 factions or 2 coalitions. They are almost equally powerful, they are informal. One represents the interests of middle class, entrepreneurial class, the region like Shanghai and Guangdong. The other represents the inland region, the poor migrant workers, farmers, and the urban poor. Now, they also cooperate with each other. Just recently in the National People's Congress, Hu Bangguo is currently ranked number 2. He's from Shanghai. He said that China should never adopt a Western-style democracy, but almost at the same time, Wen Jiabao always said that the importance of democratic change and also talk about universal value of democracy. So you see these tensions, but at the same time, they also reach out to target their own region or interest group. That's a very interesting development. This is what I call one party, 2 factions.
We touched on it a moment ago about the quote-unquote 9 old guys who make up the standing committee. Is there any way to know how much debate or disagreement goes on amongst those 9?
Well, it's still lack of transparency, but we do know there's factional tensions. And if we ask, taxi driver in Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen, they will point which one belongs to which faction, and with really very accurate. And the tension exists, but at the same time, they realize they're in the same boat, and they want to cooperate with each other. So earlier on, I mentioned that one person talked about the universal value of democracy, the other person talked about China should never go to that direction. In a way, both of them are sincere, but at the same time, they also try to not necessarily want to see the other faction or other view completely fail. This is a way to provide some kind of hope or assurance to different social groups. Now, again, the policies, sometimes getting to policy is very difficult. Like Gordon said, that there's a possible for deadlock. But at the same time, the negotiation, compromise, deal cutting become more common. So in a way, it's moving towards very much like one party LDP Japan that period. Of course, China is no democracy, but there's some important progress for fundamental change in the way about 10 or 15 years.
Sharon, we hear that the country's opening up, and yet we don't seem to hear too much about the internal squabbles that must be taking place at the highest levels of the party. How come?
Well, in part, the quick answer is that, we reference censorship, and everyone has referenced it in one way or another. But there's actually a whole body of laws, the state secrets law, where every single piece of information that we have referenced today, the environment, the health, the land grant, all of those, and economic information and statistical data are in fact classified in some way or other, particularly data that, if disclosed, would harm or seriously harm the image of the nation or harm national interests. So there's there's a whole, we did a whole state secrets report on this and looked at cases of people who are charged with it. And of course, the consequences are once you're charged with a state secrets crime, you have no access to all of the procedural protections, like access to your lawyer, the evidence, etc. So I feel that perhaps, it's not whether the cup is half full or half empty. I think the real question is for whom. And then the real serious question about progress in terms of democracy in China is, will Chinese people get to have this full out, publicly disagreeing and saying things without having, like CCTV, having a journalist ask during a CCTV program, can I ask about June 4th and what will be the policy and will that be healed and resolved? Clip, they switch to another image. Or Wen Jiabao, showing that he's online, talking to the Wangyou, the netizens, and then because we are approaching, someone asks about, well, what happened to June 4th? And then boom, that gets deleted. So I think it is very important to look at the question of not just censorship as a freedom of expression issue. It is the whole ball of wax that if there's not information that citizens can be informed by and have healthy, different debate, and that will undermine the capacity of the society and of the decision makers to both understand the problem and to come up with solutions. And we saw this during the Great Famine. Information. People were starving. Did Mao get that information? No. Did that help, address the famine? No. Did it exacerbate the suffering? Yes. That's exactly what happened with tainted milk. So I think we go back to the human rights and to think of human rights as inclusively what it is, which is access to information, all of the economic, cultural, and social rights. But if citizens don't have access to information, to talk about citizens having debate and growing within a limited, or citizens within the birdcage of the information they have access to, this is not sustainable, and this will not contribute to a sustainable structural solution. I agree there's been progress, but is it going to really result in any fundamental structural changes that's going to protect both the whole at a macro level society and as well as individual rights? Not really.
That is yet to be
because
seen.
It's
Jeremy?
already, Yeah.
What I was going to say was this. Why we don't know more about what's happening at the top is because since 1989, there's been a concerted effort to prevent that kind of information going out, or to prevent any kind of open split between the top leadership. Because in 1999, that's what happened. The reason why the crisis was so deep and so prolonged is because the students in the square and everybody else knew that there was a split at the top. That Zhao Ziyang and Deng Xiaoping were on different sides, and the party was wavering. And so since then, the party has decided no more. No matter if we disagree, even if we disagree, for example, on the treatment of Falun Gong, we know they disagreed on that. They said, we're going to have a facade of unity. At the same time, we shouldn't exaggerate the degree of closure in Chinese society. There's a lot of information around. And people do get access to all kinds of information. The government tries to hide lots of things. But in today's society, with the net and with other things, it's very hard and very difficult to control information for very long. The reason why things have gone on so well is two reasons. One is that in some ways the policies have been more or less correct. The second reason is this is very much a problem-solving government. It believes in solving problems. And they try to preempt protest by solving the problem before they get too drastic. The question is whether their desire for stability and sameness and maintaining themselves in power will now be overwhelmed by the scale of the problems that they face, so they can't simply produce this facade of unity. We don't know.
Let me follow up with Chen on that. If in fact this standing committee is made up of 9 old guys, basically, presumably they have some kind of succession plan in place. Do you have any sense about who the next leader would be?
Well, yeah, and if you look at the standing committee, there are 2 younger leaders, those leaders in their 50s. Chinese call them the 5th generation. And one is Xi Jinping. He is the vice president of China. Highly likely he will succeed Hu Jintao as president of PRC and the general secretary of the party. The other is Mr. Li Keqiang. He is the executive vice premier, and he will succeed Wen Jiabao as premier. Now, but again, there's a lot of question mark because of the, whether they are equally capable compared with Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, and how they can manage this economic crisis and etc. But in my view, that the leader in the collective leadership, these leaders can be changed, but these factions which link to some interest group in society become very strong. This is what I call strong faction but weak leaders. The leaders could be replaced, but the faction will survive, will compete for power.
Is there any reason to believe, Gordon, that this newer generation, the fifth generation, as Chan calls them, would be approaching problems any differently than the previous generation would?
You'd like to think so, but you never really know, because Deng Xiaoping was actually quite elderly when he was at the helm.
And quite revolutionary.
Quite a revolutionary around at the beginning. But his two successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, much younger, but not necessarily more liberal. And in fact, in some ways, China has gone back and not made progress since the Deng years. And these are younger guys. I think it's a question, and I think Chang Li has it right. This is a system. And you can put the Pope, or you can put the Dalai Lama, or you can put Hu Jintao in it, and you might get pretty much the same results, largely because it is a collective system. There is a very important premium on consensus. And especially at times right now, when the party is at risk, I think that there's probably going to be less factionalism in Beijing, largely because they're going to close ranks. They're going to close ranks because they do see the threats to the party. The threats might actually be existential. And so this bickering and fighting that we sometimes see during the good times might be moderated as people get together. But unfortunately, people being people, and especially the system being the system, you can have another divisive split in the leadership of the party that we saw in 1989. And this could actually be the end. This could be the end of the Chinese century.
That's really quite a nice way to sum that up. Can I thank both our out-of-town guests, Chan Li in Washington from the Brookings Institution, Sharon Hum in New York City from Human Rights in China, our three guests here in studio, Bernie Froelich from York University, Gordon Chang, Forbes.com, Jeremy Paltiel, Carleton University. Thanks so much, everybody, for your views tonight.